get started, just pray and then we'll get started. Father, thank you for the evening together, for the time in your word, and we pray that as we investigate it and wrap up the story of Ruth, you would speak to us, enlighten us not just to its narrative meaning, but its theological meaning, and how it can impact our lives and make us better witnesses for you. Guide us in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Sorry for the table again, so I have to bend down to get my text where I can see it all and what I'm looking at. So we'll have to make speedy time through chapter 4 tonight. Finish this book. I don't want to rush through it, so
We could put a chair up on the table and have you.
I thought about it. It's all right. It's all right. So let's get a running start into chapter 4. Remember, we left off at the end of chapter 3. I didn't really cover this, but Ruth returns to the house to visit, or to just return to the home and speak to Naomi. And there's this interaction that is a little unusual, and I did mention it. The translations say in verse 16, when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, that is, Naomi said, "How did it go?" or "How did you fare?" The Hebrew reads, "Who are you, my daughter?" And it's very unusual. You almost say it doesn't make sense, except I think it's intentional because that's the same question Boaz asked her when he discovered her laying next to him in the field. Who are you? Which is also a strange question to ask in that context. I guess it's not a strange question, but it's not the one I would expect him to ask. Let's put it that way. I would expect him to say, "What in the world are you doing?
Yeah.
What's going on here? Why have you uncovered my, the place of my feet?" Right, there's a lot of things I want to know if I'm him. He is interested in the identity of Ruth. He was the only one who cared to sort of grant Ruth an identity or allow her to identify herself in chapter 2. Right up to that point, she's just an appendage. She's just tagging along. Nobody recognizes her. Nobody even really pays attention to the fact that she's there. And we'll get to it tonight. But remember when Naomi comes back from Moab and comes into the gate of Bethlehem, and her complaint to the women of Bethlehem was, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." Ruth is standing with her when she says that. She's right next to her. She has her daughter-in-law with her in her life, but her assessment is, "I have nothing." Now that's going to be important. I'm going to pay that off in a few moments, but that assessment is, even Naomi doesn't really give Ruth an identity outside of, she was one of the girls that married my boys, and now she's my daughter-in-law. But even that, it's only an identity as it relates to Naomi. Boaz is the first one who gives her a chance he's the first one to address her directly, right? Not as a part of something else. And then in chapter 3, that question is to me very important. Who are you? And that's the same question that, somewhat strangely, Naomi asks as soon as she gets back. And I wonder if it's just this little mysterious note of saying, it is a way of saying what happened, how did it go? But by asking it after, identify yourself for me, it's a way, I think, of saying, like maybe in a deeper way, saying, has your identity changed at all? Because what was the plan? Send her out to the field and hopefully, I think, get this guy into a pledge to marry her, right? She wants to know, is it going to work? Are you going to have a new identity? I think is what's going on there. But it's another one of these subtleties that's hard to say this is what that means. But it's curious enough, it's worth noting, and that's my best take at what I think it might be getting at. So in any case, in verse 17, Ruth says, these 6 measures, it's a little strange. She says, "Who are you?" And Ruth tells her all that the man had done for her, which is precisely what exactly? Like, what did Boaz actually do out in that field? Almost the point of that interaction, I was arguing, is that he didn't do anything, right? There's a lot he could have done, right? And the point is, what you think he's going to do, according to the seductive setup that's presented there, the way it looks very sexually, it looks like an intimate exchange is about to take place, and that seems like a natural way to understand what a man in that situation would do. And the very payoff of that scene is that Boaz doesn't do anything, because it would be inappropriate for a godly, Torah-observant representative of Yahweh to do anything like that to this woman. So it's a little odd that she comes back and tells Naomi all that he did for her or to her. I think just by the context, what she's saying is, yes, the one thing he did is he gave me this barley, right? So they said a lot. He said some things to her, but she doesn't report what he said. I mean, presumably she does, but that's not written down. What we have is she tells Naomi what he did for her, and the next fact that's revealed is, he gave me these 6 barleys, these 6 measures of barley. It doesn't specify what the measurement is, just 6 barleys. And he said, and this wasn't recorded for us, but apparently this was part of the exchange between Ruth and Boaz. He said, you must not go back empty to your mother-in-law. So apparently Boaz has given these barleys as a signal to Naomi to be mediated through Ruth, who would then send this message back to Naomi and say, you know what? The plan, whatever it was, here's what's going to happen. This barley will represent your no longer being empty. Right? Remember chapter 1? The thing Naomi says about herself? I went away full, and Yahweh has brought me back recham, empty. And it's the same word, and I think it's not accidental. I think it's one of these literary parallels that you're meant to read as Boaz has now sent a solution for Naomi's problem. It's not just a problem that Ruth has where she needs a husband, which was why Naomi sent Ruth out there. We need to get you, menucha, we need to find a place of rest for you, find rest for you. And it's interesting that Naomi and Boaz never actually meet or interact or speak at all directly in this whole story. Never, to the very end, from the very beginning to the very end. It's always mediated. The relationship's always mediated by Ruth. Ruth is this conduit, and Boaz, but there seems to be a sense where Naomi is still the main character. And Boaz seems to know he's acting not for himself, certainly, and not even just for Ruth, although he does tremendous kindness to her and gives her her identity in a way, or allows her to reveal her own identity in a way that nobody else does. But all the while, it seems, this is all weaving back to Naomi, and Boaz seems to be aware of it somehow. So that's interesting. But I wanted to point that out just at the tie-up of chapter 3. He seems intent to be the one who will fill Naomi when she believes herself to be empty. So he says to Ruth, you're going to go back there, but you're not going to go empty. And ironically, Ruth, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in chapter 1, Ruth is the one thing left that Naomi has. She's not empty. She has Ruth. She doesn't recognize that as important. She perceives herself to be empty. So Yahweh has left me empty, even though there's a way of reading the story, again, providentially. What did Yahweh give her? He gave her Ruth, right? Because she could have just as easily hiked it back to Moab with Orpah, but she didn't. And the irony, again, is paid off in here. It's Ruth who's now bringing the barley that will fill up. And remember, I mentioned this, and it's a slightly creative reading, but it's interesting, and I credit it to Yael Ziegler in her commentary. She thinks that loading up Ruth into the wrap that she's wearing, and he says, take that off, and he loads it up, and then she carries it back, that she walks back looking like she's got a load bearing in front of her, appearing to be pregnant. And so the barley in there is the seed of the field, but it represents the seed that's going to come from their union. This is all, I admit, sort of deep level, not a surface level reading, a deeper reading, a midrashic sort of reading that says, I think there's more going on in the way this story is told, with these clever little details, that is rich with symbolism and theological meaning. So for all that, just didn't want to leave the end of chapter 3 hanging, because there's really even in that, there's some really rich details that I think require a lot of thought and investigation. And then in verse 18, this is interesting. So she, that is Naomi, replied, sit down. Just sit here. That's how it reads in Hebrew. And I intentionally invoke that because we're going to come back to that in a minute. Sit here, my daughter. Just sit down. Because until you learn how the matter will fall, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. He'll complete it. He's going to make sure that it's completed. This is the same word used in Genesis when God creates the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested from the work that he completed. She's linking Boaz with the same language. He will bring this thing to its completion. So you sit here. You can rest. He's not going to rest until he's completed it, right? Which almost gives me a creation vibe. But she tells Ruth, you sit here. And then, right into chapter 4. So let me read a bit. And the way this reads, it doesn't, it's sort of like meanwhile. I think the NIV actually translated. Meanwhile, Boaz, and that is exactly right according to the grammar. While this conversation is going on, or let's say while Ruth is going back to the house and engaging with Naomi and reporting to her, Boaz all the while is on a parallel track going into the city gate, right? These are happening concurrently, is the way that it reads in the Hebrew. And some translations will pick that up. So it's meanwhile, Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And it's the same word. So Naomi tells Ruth, you sit down. Meanwhile, Boaz is going at the same time. And what does he do? And think about this for a minute. What does he do? He sits down at the gate. It's like he gets there. He's got this he's made an oath to Ruth, I will do this. He's got a lot to work out here, as we're going to see. It's pretty complicated. And for a man who we're going to see knows how to command the people around him. I don't know if he was a military commander. Remember the word chayil, used of Boaz. Can be a man of military prowess, military skill. He may have been a warrior at some point, a soldier. But we're going to see he knows how to command, he commands authority in situations. But that's not what he starts out doing. This is fascinating to me. And it fits the theme of the whole book. And I think brings up a deep theological point to reflect on. With all this looming, the whole weight of this story hanging in the balance, all on what Boaz will choose to do, he goes to the gate of the city. This is the place of legislation, the place where judicial decrees are meted out. This is the place you have lawsuits. This is the place of the city's social and legal life. This is where everything happens. And he just sits down. He sits there. I need us to think about this for a minute. In a story where, again, God himself does not directly intervene in events. They're all either mediated by people doing things on behalf of God or in his name in some way, or they just providentially occur. In the language of the story, they occur by chance. In the reader's consciousness, you know they're occurring by providence, that God has provided for them to occur this way. But in a story that is, I would say, obsessed, if not certainly preoccupied, with making sure that's the way you understand events, it's interesting to me that Boaz gets to this point and the first thing he thinks to do is just to sit down and wait. Right? This is a very odd, but I think very important little detail.
Okay, is this the only entrance into the city, the gate? In other words, do people live inside? And he knows that what they really do is they come from outside and they go in to do business and they leave. So he's expecting people to go in and out, and he's waiting for somebody.
Yes, it's a thoroughfare.
Okay.
People coming in to transact business, people coming in and out. The gate of the city in ancient cities like this, it's a small town, but it's still got the city, the elements of the. Those would be places where, if people are coming in, there would be guards at the gate, making sure they're supposed to come in. It's pretty obvious Boaz is a respected member of the society. But yes, you're right. This is a major thoroughfare, a place of a lot of activity, business activity, social activity, legal and judicial activities. All of that happens at the gates of cities in the ancient times. So you're right. He sits there and he's observing. But my point here is he seems to just have a sense for all he needs to accomplish for this story to tie off. If he just shows up and waits, it will happen. Now, I won't get into the details and bore you with my whole theory about how from Genesis 1 and the story of creation and in the garden, I believe you have two fundamental sort of trajectories, two fundamental values of Scripture that run throughout the whole storyline of the Bible, and that all human beings tend to display more prominently, let's say, one or the other, and that is order and freedom, right? God creates an ordered world, so God is obviously a God of order. But God seems to delight in allowing freedom for his creatures. So he gives them this creation and says, here, you guard it and serve and take care of it. And he just grants them this freedom. He doesn't do things that they can do for themselves. He just says, here, you do it. But he clearly, too much freedom and you have chaos. What God in the very first verses of the Bible is doing is subduing the chaos and ordering reality. And then, from almost every point afterward, he grants humans the freedom to just choose. So he is obviously a God who cares about freedom and grants that to his people. Like the seminal story of Israel is their exodus from Egypt. It's a story of liberation from slavery. He wants people to be free. And so that's as much as I'll give you on that. But I think these are two basic, fundamental theological truths that sometimes sort of create a tension with each other. You have to figure out, and sometimes individually you have to decide which one am I, and how do I balance that with, right? For ordered people like me can be controlling, can want to wield authority in ways that tell people, here's how it's going to go, and I will make it go that way. But freedom people can be out of control, and their lives can be chaotic, right? So you need both. God is a God of both. And I have this theory that I think is pretty well exemplified in Boaz, although it could just be me begging the question, because I think I find things that you already think are right. But he seems to just believe. There's a trust here that if I am to the place I need to be, and I have determined, resolved to do the things that need to be done, it will work out. The solution will emerge somehow. Now, I think you could argue on another day, if I was in a different mood, that's irresponsible. This guy should be getting after the stuff he needs to get done. But he doesn't do that first. He just sits there and presumably waits until somebody comes by or something will happen. And then, in the characteristic way the story is told, right in the second half of verse 1, one of my favorite means of telling this story, and behold, right? If you remember nothing else about the book of Ruth in this study, you'll remember how effectively that little Hebrew word gets delivered to present drama and sort of excitement and expectation in the story. But nay, behold, the Goel of whom Boaz has spoken passed by. So this is exactly to Gary's point. Yes, Boaz just sat there, and then, what do you know? Or a French would say, voila, the guy just passes by. Oh, isn't that convenient? Now, Boaz couldn't have known he would pass by. I suppose he could have, if he was really that dialed in, or paid attention to everybody's habits all the time, like a Sherlock Holmes type. Like he knew what time every day this guy walked by. I don't tend to think that, but it's possible. I think Boaz just waits for what's going to emerge, and then he bumps into action, right? But again, from the providential perspective of that, I think the narrator wants us to have, he just happened to pass by at that time. Sometime, it reads very shortly after Boaz sat down, and what do you know? He passed by. Now here's Boaz in the giving orders mode. This is impressive. Read how some of the translations again are just too wordy. So I'll try to give you a sense of how it reads from the Hebrew. And also we have a translation issue here that I'm going to explain in a minute, so bear with me. None of your translations will say this, but okay, so he goes up. Behold, the Redeemer is passing by who Boaz had spoken. And he said, turn away, or come over here, and sit here Ploni Almoni. I'll come back and explain that in a minute. So-and-so. And he came, and he turned, and he sat. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city, and he said, sit down here. So they sat down. Immediately, as soon as the guy happens to be on the scene, Boaz starts just telling people what to do, and they do it immediately. And the Hebrew kind of reads that way. But even in just reading the English translations, you get the sense that this guy is a guy who's listened to when he says, and he doesn't ask. He just says, you come do this. And they just do it. Steve?
I find it interesting that 10 of the elders are there. So you get the picture, I think, it's not only, major thoroughfare, but it's a place of civil court, if you will.
Exactly right.
There's things that go on, and so elders are there.
Yeah.
To take in conference and make a decision.
Yeah, totally. These would be the, say, sages, the elders of the town would be sort of the, maybe not legal experts, but possibly. And certainly the wise, sage, elderly men of the city whose job it would be. And not like, they didn't have these things formally worked out the way we think of in law, degrees from law school and stuff. But they would have had the responsibility for the people, for the village, for the city, to serve as, yes, exactly, these types of civil servants. It's actually partly from this story that Judaism to this day has a rule, a halakhic rule, that you cannot have a synagogue in a location unless you have 10 males who can constitute its membership. It's called a minyan. And this is one of the places that they cite that says Boaz essentially creates the first minyan. He's the first one who sort of decrees that this is how we need to legally operate. That's not entirely it, because you have this also back in Sodom. Lot is trying to save the city. He's like, hey, if I can get it down to 10, if I can find 10 men, right, or 10 righteous people. But this is precisely the case. You're looking at people whose responsibility for their family, their mishpacha, their family and their tribal unit in this area would be to sit here and make these kinds of judgments. And Boaz seems to be certainly a leader among them, and possibly the leader who just kind of is a judge in the period of Judges, right? But you can see his authority, and it is just not questioned. He seems to be a man who commands respect.
Well, then wouldn't it make sense that that would be the place he would go? If that's the place where the decision makers gather,
for sure.
Then it doesn't seem so random that he was
went
there and sat
Yeah.
down. I mean, that's where he needed to be to
Correct.
accomplish what he was
No, it's not at all random that he goes to this spot. This is the place he needs to be. He knows that. That's carefully selected. He wouldn't just wander around the town hoping something would happen. He goes to the place he knows this decision will need to be rendered. But the providential thing there that he's not planning is he can't plan whether this guy will just happen to be there, right? He doesn't know that, presumably. He doesn't know this guy's habits and schedule. There's an element of chance whether he goes there if the other Redeemer even shows up. And that's the part that's providentially seems to be, right, delivered on time and on target just when he needed to make it. And then as soon as the guy shows up, he calls together the minyan, the quorum, and starts to hold court.
Okay, so my question is, it says elders, it can be any citizen? So he would just go, I want you,
That's possible, but I think Steve's onto what's probably likely. These would be men whose, again, if not legal job description, their informal role in the community would be to be available for these types of judgments and serve as the local court, right? Like not the high court, but like a territorial court.
Like
So would
mediators.
he had to go hunt them down, or would he?
Presumably they're nearby, or maybe even sitting in their sort of semi-official positions that they always do. They may already be there rendering decisions on other things, helping people with other business transactions, what have you. That's the sense I get. But I guess either is possible. He could have gone around and quickly rounded them all up. It doesn't matter too much for the purposes of the story. But what is important is the way Boaz seems to have control of this body without any real question or hesitation in anyone else's mind. So then, verse 3, he begins to speak directly to the Redeemer. But let's talk about this Redeemer who he just says, when he addresses him, and this is a little weird. So translations will say just like he said, turn aside friend, or turn aside so-and-so. The name of this man is not actually given in the Hebrew text. Presumably Boaz knew his name and used it. Right? If you had a video camera recording this, right? If you're recording this from video footage, like Bethlehem security footage at the city gate, if they picked up the audio, he would have said whatever this guy's name was. But the author has done a dub job, like in movies.
Yeah.
He's saying, turn aside, and then it would dub over. And the author has put in there a sort of made-up nonsense word. And in Hebrew, it's sort of a rhyming little word that doesn't have an exact meaning. Ploni almoni. And there's all sorts of speculation and debate about what this actually means, and we don't really know for sure. It seems to be intentionally designed to be a rhyming, sort of silly-sounding name, almost like helter-skelter, right? We use words that just, they don't have definition, dictionary meanings. As such, we've just combined them together to make a sound, and then when we say it, we know like, oh, helter-skelter means things are, random and chaotic and running out of control or whatever. Like, it's almost onomatopoetic. It's almost, the rhyme of it seems to be designed just to be whatever. In fact, it is used elsewhere in the Bible. It's usually used of places, but when the place being described is meant to be just an anonymous place. So you go to so-and-so a place and meet me there. That's the way it's normally used. It's not usually used of people. This is a unique case, but it seems to have the same idea. The author, in other words, seems to want very deliberately to anonymize this guy. He wants to write his name out of the story and just give him, he's just the guy who became unnamed in the story. And we'll get to this in a little more depth in a moment. But like in Jewish tradition, it's pretty common to call him something like Mr. Anonymous or Mr. So-and-so. This is the way we use like John Doe, right? He's just a John Doe at this point. Why he is a John Doe seems to be related to what the role he's going to play in the story, which is he has a chance to actually write his name into Israel's story, to write his name into the history of Israel as a Goel, as a redeemer. And he doesn't do anything wrong, right? He doesn't seem to be a bad guy. There's no evidence that he's, a villain. I'm not sure there is a villain of this story, right? Who is the bad guy in the story of Ruth? The antagonist is just life itself and circumstances and choices. So he's not a bad guy. He's kind of like Orpah in chapter 1. She didn't do anything wrong. She did a sensible thing, actually. But she's out of the story. Or the servant in chapter 2. Boaz is Naah, his servant. Who is this girl? And he's like the guy I like the least in the story. But he doesn't really do anything that terrible. He just doesn't really treat Ruth with any honor. And so he doesn't have a name. And I think you have something else going on here. This guy doesn't have a name because the narrator doesn't want to give him a name because, as we'll see, chapter 4 is very much about the story of how names convey meaning and how names are resurrected and brought back from death, right? Names have a whole lot of importance in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, right? And this guy seems to be intentionally stripped of his name. So the narrator sends a little message that he's just so-and-so. He could have been something. He could have been a name that you remember. But for the storyteller, for the author of Ruth, he should just be thought of as Ploni Almoni, the guy whose name nobody knows, because nobody needs to know it, right? So, but it's a little odd, and translations are all over the map here. So that's the best explanation of that I can give. Yes?
Doesn't he have to be a relative, a closer relative than Boaz?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's the point. And we don't know exactly the speculation or guesses. It's possible Boaz is like a, say, nephew of Elimelech, and this would be a cousin or not a brother, but maybe like an uncle. So, but yes, the idea is, according to the Torah, the closer relative has the first opportunity to perform the redemption. So yeah, they're related. How exactly we don't know.
Yeah.
They're not close relations, but they're related.
So I kind of missed the connection. So are you saying Poloni, Almoni, in this translation, they translated it into friend? Or did they just
yes.
leave it out in the translation?
No, in the ESV it just says, sit here, friend. But I have other translations that just render it almost wildly differently. I could give you a few examples here, but no, most translations will have something in there. When he says, sit down here, they'll put something else there. I'm just pointing out, it's not a translation of what the Hebrew means, because we don't really know what Ploni Almoni means, and translators don't know what to do with it. So, yeah, I'm just trying to see.
It could be the English phony baloney.
That's great. That's great. It's a totally analog there. They're very similar. It's just, almost stuff that kids make up, or we use to communicate with kids, to communicate something that they will understand, but doesn't have a clear definitional meaning to it. So yeah, usually it's something like friend. King James is actually interesting. It says, "Oh, such a one," which is great. It's actually close to what the author means for you to take away from it. But in any case, that's Ploni Almoni, the guy who's just Mr. So-and-so because of the opportunity he had but didn't take.
The complete Jewish Bible says such and such.
Yeah, that's great. That's something like that is about the closest I can get to saying that's what it's meant to communicate.
Such and such, he says.
Yeah.
Come sit down.
Yeah.
So strange. Wow.
Yeah. He's just a
Sounds like you so-and-so.
yeah. Yeah.
Hey, you,
Hey, so-and-so. Yeah. Okay. Sit down here. They sat down. Then, verse 3, he said to the Goel, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling a parcel of land, possibly has sold a parcel of land, that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So, I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. All right, so this is very, it can get confusing. It's a little, not everything is totally clear what's going on here. Remember what Boaz struck out when he left Ruth, intent on doing. At least what we took away from that encounter that he was planning on doing. We think he's pledged to marry her. But remember what she said. Spread your garment over me, which does invoke marriage, but for you are a goel, a redeemer, which is not about marriage. So we don't know if I'm confused. We don't know who's confused in the story, or if they've got this all worked out like in a prearranged plan, or, as I kind of suspect, whatever anyone means, Boaz is going to tie this all, he's going to weave these threads together and make it work. But there is this convergence of redemption, which is a law in Leviticus and elsewhere in the Torah that usually has to do with purchasing back land that has been sold off of necessity because the owner or the family has come into poverty of some sort or can no longer sustain themselves or their land, so they have to sell it to make a living, right, or to provide for their family. The process of and the obligation on a close relative, a member of the family, to purchase that land back and restore it to the family, because land in Israel's legislation was always supposed to remain with the family allotment, within the family and tribal allotment. Those are the laws about Geulah, redemption. A person can also be sold into slavery if they have to sell themselves into slavery, let's say like an indentured servant of some sort, they can be redeemed. But that would just be a way to give them their freedom. It doesn't involve marriage, like in any of the examples of the Torah, or the legislation of the Torah, or any of the examples that we have. Geulah, redemption, is about land and people being restored to their proper place, right, and their freedom. why we're all of a sudden talking about merging together these laws of redemption, and another law that seems to be coming into play here, which is, I mentioned before, but we'll look at more depth tonight, called Yibum, laws of levirate marriage. We're not entirely clear, because they don't have anything to do with each other if you read the Torah, where you find the instructions about these two laws, these two separate strains of legislation, Torah instruction telling us, here's what happens if you need to do a redemption. And then with Yibum, with levirate marriage, here's what happens if if a man dies without children, and he has brothers that live with him, and they can marry his widow and raise up children. Like, these are two totally separate laws that don't seem to have anything to do with one another. But all of a sudden here, they're being merged together. So it's not entirely clear immediately why Boaz has run off, sat down, called a session of the council together, and then started with, hey, you know that land that Naomi either had to sell or is now putting up for sale? That's a little unclear to me. It's hard to say from chapter 1. We don't really know what happened to it. They just left it, right? But it's interesting that he starts with the land. And I'm going to argue that's probably very deliberate. And this guy's response is part of the evidence that I bring to say that, oh yeah, sure, I can afford that. Sounds like a good deal. I'll get the plot of land. Why not? Right? He gets to do a mitzvah, a good deed, fulfill the Torah that you're supposed to redeem land if your relative has to sell it off. And, sweet, give me some land. And then Boaz throws this thing into a whole tizzy. Like it's very hard to say, well, wait, what was this? What is he doing here? Verse 5, then Boaz said, all right, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to literally raise up the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So Boaz is obviously shaking this guy by throwing Ruth into the deal. Yeah, you have to marry this. Now, there's a lot of details to sort through here, and I won't be able to give you all of them. We just don't have the time, and it's quite complex. But there's a totally intriguing and not easy to explain textual sort of anomaly here, although it happens a lot in Ruth, and I've skipped over a bunch of them. So maybe you want to, like for the paid subscribers, I'll explain this in another session. I don't know. But there's a phenomenon here where in almost all of, I suspect, your translations in verse 5, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, that is how everything in almost every translation I found reads. If you open the Hebrew text, that's not what it says. This is a phenomenon in scholarship known as kariv ukatif, what is read being different from what is written. So the Hebrew text says, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, I will acquire Ruth, the Moabite. That is what is written in the Hebrew text. It is never translated that way. And in Jewish tradition, that would be what's called the katif, what's written. But they have the tradition of kareh, what's read. So when you read this in the synagogue, you read it the way we have it in our translations. You also take Naomi. You also take Ruth, right? You marry Ruth. And this creates a real question of what is being said here. You had another version of this in the beginning of last chapter, when Naomi sends Ruth down, go down, get dressed up, wash and anoint yourself, go down and lie down. There's another one of these kativ and kareh phenomenon there, where it actually says, when I lie down, go down there and I will lie down. It's as if Naomi is being, vicariously acting through Ruth's actions. that's interesting. I skipped over it, but it's really interesting to think about. Partly because of chapter 1, where Ruth makes her pledge, your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you lie down, I will lie down. It's the same language, same word. The grammar is identical. So chapter 2 looks like this strange textual anomaly where it's written one way, but read another way is another one of these things kept popping up where Ruth is lying down, literally, physically lying down next to Boaz, but somehow metaphorically or metaphysically, or I don't know, representatively, Naomi is lying there as well. Like she is the one that has everything at stake as much as Ruth does. And I wonder if it's not something else here, where either Boaz, now there's a scholar, Hebrew Bible scholar who I really like and whose work on Ruth is great, called Daniel Block. Block argues it just should be understood the way it's read. The way it's written. Boaz is here offering, if you buy the field, I will marry Ruth. And that's totally plausible. It's just that nobody else interprets it that way. Everyone just goes with the way it's read and says, Boaz is telling this guy, you have to buy the field, or if you purchase the field, you also have to marry Ruth. So Block's suggestion is interesting. He just says, it's written, you buy the field, I will marry Ruth. And he says that makes sense because Boaz could just be making an arrangement here that he will handle the redemption of the land, the Poloni Almoni, and Boaz is going to take responsibility for the whole family, and he will take on the marriage, because you can imagine why a guy might not want to take on a wife with all the responsibilities that came with, and we don't know anything else about this guy, but he may be older. He may be older even than Boaz. In fact, he probably is. So maybe that's just too late in life to marry a young woman and try to keep up with all the responsibilities of that. We don't know. It's a little complicated. Or it could be something like Boaz. I think that's totally plausible. Boaz is making a 2-part deal, and he's going to carry on the second part. That would help explain why this guy says, wait a minute, then what happens if you two have a baby? Does he then have a claim to this land? Which legally seems like should be the case. And that guy realizes, oh, well then I'm not going to, this won't pass on to my kids. If you have a baby of son, it will pass on to him. And no, that's going to blow the deal. I risk my estate. So it's all quite complicated. I'm not certain, but I think that's possible. Boaz is offering to marry Ruth, according to the way it's written. I also think Boaz could be doing something even deeper, which is to say, present the law of redemption and the obligation/opportunity for this guy to take the land, to buy the land back. But I think Boaz then reads the Torah more deeply than that. It's not just, hey, do you want this land? You can get the land. That has a financial benefit. It is a good deed. You keep the property and keep the inheritance in the family. But I think Boaz is going layers deeper than that. He's saying, just redeeming land is good, but that's just what the Torah says can and should be done. We can do better than that. Why would you want to raise up land? Why would you want to redeem land that had been lost? What good is land? Well, it's good for growing food, which you need, which is one of the whole points of this story. Right? Started with a famine, we need the food. Get the land back, you can work it, you can raise food. Great. But that's kind of, again, that's a surface level benefit. That's something the Torah cares about. That's something God is concerned with. That is, people should have food and that they should be able to raise food. But that's part of the covenant. But what's that land and that food really about? Raising up families in Israel, covenant families who represent God and his covenant, who can then take that food and do precisely what Boaz does throughout the whole story, right? Give it generously. Give it to people. Show chesed. Be kind. Exercise chayil, valor, in his character by using the food to bless people. I think what he's doing here is saying, you can get the land, and it can be yours. But the right way to interpret Torah is to say, you also should care for families, for people, and put them on the land. Then you've completed the Torah. You've filled it up. Or, if it helps you, this helps me. If you imagine Boaz saying, you have heard it said, you should redeem your brother's land. And I say to you, you should raise up a son for your brother by marrying his widow. Does that make sense? Is that, you're picking down what I'm dropping? Are you picking up what I'm dropping down?
That's what I was thinking,
Right?
is Ruth is not an estranged family member, but her position is somewhat ambiguous.
Right.
Because Naomi no longer has that family identity because all the guys are gone.
Right.
And so Boaz he's always recognized her as that family member. How many times does he make a comment? Oh, I've heard about you and your faithfulness and your drive. So again, I'm at that same point of saying he's wanting to give Ruth that family identity again.
Yeah, I think so. And I think because there are no men left in the story, it has to happen through the women. But the Torah doesn't exactly address how women relate to the... Like, we're not even clear, does Naomi still own this land? He says you purchase it back from her hand, but he also says it may be that she already sold it, right? If she has this land, why hasn't she been using it to get food already? It's very unclear and it's difficult, but I think that's right. The point here seems to me to be Boaz is merging these two laws together, even though in a straightforward, simple reading, they don't really have anything to do with each other. Marriage of the deceased man's widow to raise up a son and redeeming the land when it has to be sold off are not obviously connected. But to Boaz, they are. And I think that's a profound way of doing what Jesus, in fact, teaches is the way to read the Torah. Yes, it says this, and I say it has to go deeper than that. I think this is a great example of Boaz being a Jesus-like reader of the Torah, where he's not just saying, you can, and you probably should, redeem this land. He's saying, if you want to honor God and observe Torah, you need to do it. You need to consider what the Torah is about, right? And it's about not just the land, but the people in covenant on the land. And to get that worked out, you got to go deeper. So it's a fascinating and, again, complicated. We haven't covered all the things there are to talk about here, but there's a lot going on. I'm just giving you some of the main sort of ways of interpreting this and the one I favor. But it is quite difficult to say exactly what's going on here. But in any case, you get the sense, nobody questions Boaz's interpretation of this. They're just like, yeah, you're right, apparently. But the guy realizes, oh, that would cause me to, I don't want to do it if it's that burdensome, right? Or if it would, yeah. So again, understandable, but he has a chance here and he declines it precisely on the grounds that what Boaz is offering, he doesn't want to go that far. Boaz is the one who will. Sorry, Derek, go ahead.
What's a Masoretic text?
Oh, okay. A little more than we have time for here tonight, but the basic standard Hebrew text that's used for most translations certainly in Jewish tradition and in a lot of Christian Bibles is called the Masoretic, and that's just the Masoretes are a team of scribes in the Middle Ages or so, somewhere around 900 to 1000 AD, who compile all from the sources they have, and they are the ones who copied down the Torah, the Hebrew Bible that we tend to use to translate today.
Okay,
I'm not a textual scholar, it's hard to explain.
My footnote, I don't want to put a kink into this, but right where it says you also acquire Ruth, there's a footnote that says you also buy it from Ruth.
Correct, it could be interpreted that way.
So then it's immediately followed by the Moabite. So does he go, oh, I can't do it?
That's unclear. It can be translated, you buy it from Ruth as well as Naomi, but that's not entirely clear. What I think he does do on purpose is to say, right, he's already mentioned Naomi who came back from Moab and Ruth the Moabite. He wants to load this guy up with the fact that, these women of our broader clan who have Moabite associations, why don't you redeem them and take responsibility for the family? I think that might be intentional because he wants to remind this guy, I suspect he knows the guy will find that distasteful, right? And he's angling precisely for that. But remember, Boaz is not being deceptive here. He's not trying to get around what the Torah says or being dishonest about what his intentions are. He says his intentions. If you don't do it, I want to do it. So he can't skirt the issue by being dishonest about it. He has to be forthcoming. But he also presents it in such a way that I think he knows this guy's not going to take this offer. So, I don't know how you want to describe that, but I'm pretty convinced that's what he's doing. The translation there of, is it, right, you acquire it from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire it from Ruth, or you also acquire Ruth. That's tricky. That's up for debate, and I am not, just like I'm not a textual, I don't know enough about textual criticism to explain the whole Masoretic background. I can't sort that Hebrew out, but it's possible. It's possible. It would be unusual, but it's already unusual that he's purchasing it from the hand of Naomi, because we're not sure how that's working either. But in any case, let's keep moving a little bit into verse 7. And this, the author throws in a little side note as a reminder to the people reading this, because apparently it's written at a later time and they're not aware of these customs anymore. So verse 7, he says, "Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting things in Israel." He just drops that little note in about, this is how they used to seal legal business transactions like this. All right. So it's a weird custom to us, obviously. It was apparently an unknown or weird custom to the people in the days where Ruth was written. So they had to be reminded of this weird custom. But for all of that, and then in verse 8, when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "You buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Now the he there, that's a little, we don't know who drew off whose sandal, for sure. I suspect the Redeemer, the Goel, Poloni Amoni, took off his sandal, gave it to Boaz, but we don't know. In any case, that it happens, and it's explained before it happens, but why is that included at all? And one of the clearest reasons to me has to do with the actual laws about Yibum, the levirate marriage laws in Deuteronomy 25. Turn there if you have your Bibles. This is worth looking at, and we don't have too much time, so we'll have to do it quickly.
Did he keep the sandal? Did the guy walk barefoot for the rest of the day?
Good question. I don't know if this was purely symbolic, or if he actually took his sandal and the guy had to limp home to, show that this transaction. I don't know. What is significant here is Deuteronomy 25. So Deuteronomy 25, look at verse 9. No, sorry. Let's read the whole lead up in verse 5. I'll read it for you. Follow along if you have your Bible open. "If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother." That is Yavam. So that's where Yibum comes from. It's also where the Latin lavir comes from, brother-in-law. "Perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. If the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say," now note all these details, right? It's to raise up a name so that he won't be blotted out. The man who doesn't want to do it, he goes to the gate and the elders. That's where we are in Ruth. And he says, she goes there and she says, "My husband's brother refuses to raise up his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform Yibum, he will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, 'I do not wish to take her,' then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face," or possibly spit in front of him. "And she shall answer and say, 'So shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him whose sandal was pulled off. So this would be the name his household would bear the rest of his days. So not only does he walk away without a shoe, he gets stuck with this name of him who is unsandaled, right? It's like, whose house is unsandaled. It's a bizarre ritual, right? This whole crazy law and a bizarre ritual. And Ruth, chapter 4, is clearly drawing on this law in Deuteronomy 25. But it's clearly not the same thing. This is not a story of Yibum. It's not legally, strictly speaking, a case of Yibum. They're not brothers. Right? It's some other further out relative. It's a close relative, according to the redemption laws. But Yibum is about brothers. It's just not, it doesn't clearly map to the case we're looking at in Ruth chapter 4. But the author of Ruth clearly wants you to think about Deuteronomy 25 when you read this story, right? And Boaz seems very deliberately to be playing with the laws of Yibum in Deuteronomy 25 to determine why is it so important that Ruth should be brought under his wings and married, and that they should raise up the name of the dead. I think Boaz is reading Deuteronomy 25 and again interpreting it according to what is Deuteronomy 25 about, right? If you had to explain to somebody, hey, can you tell me about the levirate marriage laws in Deuteronomy? I could give it a stab, but it's a little weird, right? It's a little hard to, there's a lot of mysterious things about it. The man is expected to, but not really obligated. He doesn't have to. But if he doesn't, he's shamed, he's publicly humiliated, spit in his face, and give him this, he's the unsandaled one, and like, it's a dynamic, weird, unusual, hard to explain situation. What's it about? Raising up the name of a dead brother. It's about brothers dwelling together in unity. It's about brothers honoring each other by raising up their name, causing their name, putting their name ahead of their own interests, and saying, I will do this thing for you to perpetuate your name. If a name is lost in the Bible, it is a tragedy beyond our comprehending, and we just don't think of that. The name is your identity, your reputation, your essential sort of essence, who you are is your name. The name is perpetuated in your children, so it's your future. But it's also your past because everyone knows by reputation what you are, and that's called your name, right? You bear a good name if you have a good reputation for how people remember you. So a name is just, it's hard to overstate the theological and sort of sociological importance of a name in the Bible, throughout the Bible. And Deuteronomy 25, the Yibum section there about the levirate marriage, is about perpetuating a name for a brother. And I think Boaz seems to grasp that in some profound way that may take us all the way back to Genesis 4, right? Where two brothers dwelling together. And what does the one do to the other? He erases his name from the earth, right? Think about the story, the storylines throughout the Hebrew Bible that are being woven together here in the book of Ruth, right? You have the man and the woman uniting in an almost completely mutual, as a completely mutual pair. That repairs, it seems to recast the Adam and Eve story in Genesis 3, where once sin is introduced, what's the first thing God says to the woman? You will have sorrow, grief in childbearing and conception, and your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. And Ruth and Boaz, you don't have any of that. Right? We'll get to the child conception in a moment, but it's almost completely mutual here. And then chapter 4 of Genesis, the brothers, to me it looks like it's being repaired here too. Boaz seems to be mindful. Oh, you know what we need to do? We reunite land and brother and perpetuate the name, and that is what Torah is about, and that's what the covenant's about. And it's a really sort of brilliant and baffling thing that he's doing here. And I think, sorry, this is a long way of saying, that's why the author drops in this little note about the sandal being taken out. That was apparently an ancient ritual that they used to transact real estate deals this way, but that's not why the author put it there. He put it there to remind you of Deuteronomy 25 and what was supposed to happen when the Redeemer, or when the brother-in-law failed to take responsibility, then he got his sandal removed for it as a shaming ritual. It's not meant to hear. And at which point, in verse 9, Boaz takes the opportunity. He said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day." Right? This is a legal transaction, remember. And he's now he's formalizing it for everyone to sign off on. "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Machlon. Also, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Machlon." And we didn't know actually which brother she was married to until just now in the story, but in any case, it's Machlon. "I have acquired to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers, and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May Yahweh make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act with Hayil. May you be virtuous. May you do valor in Ephrathah, and be renowned, or may you have a name in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the seed that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz proclaims, "You are all witnesses. I need you to attest to this legal transaction that's taken place. I've got the land. I'm also marrying Ruth, the Moabite." It's interesting. He tells everyone she's a Moabite. Like, this is a guy who's not afraid of what people think of him. Right? "Yes, I'm marrying this Moabite. I don't consider her a Moabite," Steve's point earlier. But he's the one. By his decree here, he's bringing her into Israel. He's raising up the name of Elimelech and Machlon. He's resolving this whole thing. And if I had more time, I'd build out the case why he's also resolving Genesis 3 and the man and the woman and their problems in relating to each other in marriage. And Cain and Abel, he's resolving that. Lot and his daughters, which we talked about last week. Judah and Tamar, which the people now invoke the blessing, say, wait, may they be like, Judah and Tamar. It's like, whoa. Yeah, he's repaired that story too. He's tying up all these threads, and it's just this beautiful, it's not just the redemption of this land and this story. It is a picture of a broader redemption, right? So you think about, like, one of the places the laws of redemption, Geulah, has relevance in the prophets is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is visited by a cousin, and he's like, hey, I got this land, I need you to redeem it. Jeremiah redeems it, right? There's this whole story, I don't have time for it. But the point there is that, like, what do you need to know about Jeremiah's real estate history? You don't. Jeremiah's redeeming of the land is a picture, it's a type of Yahweh who will redeem the land of Israel, right? Because Israel has gone into exile. They have been sold into slavery again. So he will redeem, right? Jeremiah does in microcosm what Yahweh is going to do for his people in macrocosm. It's the same thing here. Boaz is doing in this little story of individuals that we barely know and don't really know much about. He's fulfilling a much bigger story, or he's typifying. He is symbolically enacting threads of a much larger story that I'm going to argue gets us all the way to Jesus and how he will read, interpret, and fulfill Torah himself. How he is bringing all these stories into himself and saying they need to be repaired and redeemed and restored, but it's not going to happen in ways that you expect. And it's not totally going to happen just by showing up, kicking butt, taking control, and doing everything that needs to be done. It's going to happen by showing up and just seemingly letting events overtake him. What's he doing? Get to work. And you see this all through the Gospels, where his disciples are like, hey, we're going to, John the Baptist, is it this time you're going to, right? Are you the one we should look for? Or should we pin our hopes on it? he just waits for what's going to emerge, but he knows it's going to emerge. He knows he will have the opportunity to act and to do it. But a lot of it is just, let's wait and see where God provides, and let's act in accordance with the Spirit and interpret the Torah according to the Spirit, not according to just, here's the bare minimum of things you're supposed to do. And anyway, it's this sort of powerful concatenation of events that you could not have predicted. If this is the right, when the story started, you would be like, this is a weird way to resolve everything. But it is how things get tied up. All right, so verse 13. So the Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. He went into her. And this is a phrase, by my research, I've never seen anywhere else in the Bible. And the Lord gave her conception. That's just not the normal way you say she got pregnant. And I think it's important. And it's also the same word in Genesis that's used in Genesis 3. In pain, you will conceive, he says to Eve. That's one of the reasons I think Ruth here is a restoration of the Eve narrative in a way. But that's for another time. And she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi. Remember, it was the women who greeted Naomi in chapter 1 when she came to Bethlehem. Now it's the women, and it's a whole different tune. Everything has been reversed, right? Blessed be Yahweh, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. May his name, may he be called a name in Bethlehem. That's how it reads. And renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. There's a whole bunch going on here. I think we're over our time, so I won't go into it all. But may Yahweh, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. Who's the redeemer in this blessing that the women are pronouncing? This is what I want. Like, it's an honest question. How do you read that?
The new baby?
The baby.
Right. Don't feel bad that I already got 2 answers floating around the room. I have at least 3. It seems to me it could be the baby who's on the way, or the baby who's come, right? He's the one who will restore Naomi's life. That's what they seem to be saying. But all throughout, the Redeemer has been Boaz. Who's really the Redeemer here, folks? Who's redeemed this whole thing?
Ruth?
Yeah. The author didn't tell you that, but you know that, right? Yahweh is the Redeemer. Boaz is the Redeemer. Oved, the baby, is the Redeemer. Because that's how the story of redemption works. It works through these channels of blessing. There's not just one way blessing comes and one way redemption works. It works dynamically. Anyway, curious little detail. I just thought I'd hear what you guys have to say about that. Your daughter-in-law is better to you than 7 sons. That is actually part of the denouement also of the story of Job. And the parallels here, this would be for your own reading, I'm not going to get into it, but between Naomi and Job at the beginning of the story, right? Shaddai has turned his hand against me. She uses language that Job uses. By the end of the story of Job, what happens? The same phrase is used, right? He says at one point the same thing, better than 7 sons, and it's parallel language, and I suspect we're meant to see a sort of similar restoration of things that were lost, but in any case. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse, and that's a bit of a curious thing to figure that out. She becomes the main caretaker for the baby. There are people who read this as formally, she legally adopts him as her son because of what the women then proclaim. Right? A son has been born to Naomi in verse 17, and they named him Oved. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Block points out, Daniel Block points out, it doesn't have to be describing actual legal adoption. Probably isn't. And I'm with him. That sounds like there's no reason that has to be what's going on here. It's just a way of saying, think about the way it's described. She takes him and lays him, I don't know, sort of on her bosom or against her breast or in her lap. Different ways to translate that. And became his, let's say nanny. Right? Let's use the language of something like a nanny. This could just be, and I think probably is, the language of that every grandma knows. Right? You take that baby, and it may as well be your baby because you're Nana. you're Noni, you're whatever she is his caretaker in a very real way. And remember, ancient households were multi-generational. They did, like, mother-in-law didn't live over here, like they lived together. So same household, mom and grandma, you know that baby's got more than one source of nourishment and care. So that's what Block argues is going on here, and I think that's probably right. It doesn't have to be a formal adoption where she is actually understood to be the mom of this baby. It's a term of intimacy, and it's describing the reality of their daily life, not a legal transaction. But in any case, the women of the neighborhood give him a name, and that's unusual. Why do they get to name him? I don't know, that's a question for another day. A son has been born to Naomi. Again, it doesn't mean legally her son, it means like, oh my gosh, she has this boy in her life now. Everything is back to what she wished it would be in chapter 1. She's full again, right? She's no longer rechim, right? She's no longer empty. They named him Oved, which means servant. It's a term used throughout the book of Isaiah for the Oved Yahweh, the servant of Yahweh. You are my servant. We would refer to that as Jesus, but in Isaiah, sometimes it's Israel, the nation, and sometimes it is this picture of the Messiah who's coming. Oved takes the name that shares the name with Isaiah's servant. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. The last word in the story tells you what it was about all along. David. Now, it's about a lot more than that, right? It's about chesed. It's about redemption. It's about all the things we've talked about. But presumably, one of the reasons the author writes this whole story to begin with is because he wants to make the case. You need to know about David and where he comes from, because that tells you the type of king who is the ideal king in Israel. It's the king of Chayil. It's the king of Hesed. It's the king who is like Boaz and Ruth, who comes from Boaz and Ruth. He embodies everything that Boaz and Ruth embody in the story. And then, that is the end of the story, but it's not the end of the scroll. The scroll ends with a genealogy. Bizarre to modern readers, but not that unusual in the ancient world. And these are the generations of Perez, starting with Perez, remember, Judah's son, who came from the union of Judah and Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Aminadab, Aminadab fathered Nachshon, Nachshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Oved, Oved fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Won't get into all the everything going on in this genealogy. Genealogies are more interesting than you think, but we don't have time. The genealogy ends with David as well, right? Just in case you missed it, when the story ended with David, the genealogy also ends with David. It's interesting the way you spell David's name, the 3 letters of David's name, David, also is the way you say beloved, right? In a story that we think of as a love story, but I have argued is not a romance story, it's a deeper than romance love story, right? Because it gets you to the picture of the beloved, who is David. But you know David is only representative of a deeper and yet to come beloved one, who is the Messiah. So a lot of ways to look at this, and that's good enough for tonight to tie this whole story off. Appreciate you guys rolling with me for a lot of, I admit, arcane details. Hopefully interesting enough that you learned something. Hopefully gives you a way to read the Bible that, you're asking questions and trying to read deeper and connecting it with other parts of the Bible. That's one of the best sort of skills you can learn. And sure appreciate rolling with me this whole time. It's a lot of fun. All right. I know we ran late tonight, and I don't know if I'll get in trouble for that, but what are they going to do? Dock my pay or not let me keep going like when we're done. So. But sorry to keep you here till late if you have to go. I get it.
I got so
Oh,
Yeah, they'll send me into Plonio Money status.
What are you going to teach next?